Everyone thinks the Second World War ended with peace conferences, victory parades, and justice served at Nuremberg. But the real treaty, the one that shaped the world we live in today, wasn't signed in Berlin or Tokyo. It was signed in a quiet resort in New Hampshire, surrounded not by generals, but by bankers and economists. Bretton Woods, 1944, the birthplace of the modern empire. We're told the IMF and the World Bank were created to rebuild a shattered world, that they were acts of mercy, the financial version of the Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan. But if you look closely, you'll see something else, a carefully engineered system to shift the center of global gravity, from London to Washington, from gold to the dollar. While cities still burned in Europe, a new kind of conquest was already underway, one fought not with tanks, but with loans. Because wars end, but debts do not. Armies withdraw, but interest compounds. And when the smoke cleared in 1945, the world discovered a strange paradox. The supposed victors of the war, Britain, France, were bankrupt. The supposed arsenal of democracy, the United States, had become the world's largest creditor. The gold of Europe had sailed across the Atlantic. The U.S. Treasury now held 2/3 of the planet's reserves. So when 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, the question wasn't how to rebuild the world. It was who will control the rebuilding. The IMF and the World Bank weren't born out of charity, they were born out of necessity. America's necessity to turn its wartime surplus into peacetime power. To prevent another Great Depression, yes, but also to ensure that every rebuilding nation would rebuild through the dollar. The British called it cooperation, the Americans called it leadership. But what really began that summer was the transformation of war debt into empire credit, a financial architecture that looked like aid but functioned like control. A global loan office disguised as salvation. Think of it this way. In 1914, empires ruled with armies. By 1944, they ruled with currencies. Instead of gunboats, balance sheets. Instead of colonies, conditional loans. The world didn't escape empire after World War II, it just upgraded the software. And that's the paradox most history books skip. The institutions meant to stabilize the world were designed by those who already owned the gold, the factories, and the printing presses. The system was never neutral. It was mathematical imperialism dressed in humanitarian language. If this already makes you see the post-war world differently, comment where you're watching from, because to understand our present crises, the debt explosions, the IMF rescues, the strong dollar, we need to go back to that mountain resort in 1944, where the modern empire was quietly coded into existence. It's July 1944. The war isn't even over yet. Hitler is still in his bunker, Tokyo still fights in the Pacific, but in the small American town of Bretton Woods, 730 delegates from 44 nations have gathered. They say they've come to design a new world economy. But behind the speeches about cooperation and peace, a deeper agenda hums. Who will write the rules of money after the empires fall? Two men dominate the room. One is John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, an empire collapsing under its own weight, drained of gold, drowning in debt. The other is Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, a nation flush with reserves, production, and ambition. Keynes dreams of balance, proposing a new supranational currency called the Bancor, a neutral unit of account designed to prevent any one country from dominating. White smiles politely, then kills the idea. Why invent a new currency, he asks, when the dollar already holds the gold? That single question seals the century. Because at that moment, the United States had something no one else did. 2/3 of the world's gold stock, half its industrial capacity, and the only economy untouched by bombs. Europe was rubble. Asia was hunger. The Soviet Union was secretive and broke. And America, with its treasury vaults full of the world's collateral, offered a deal too reasonable to refuse. Here's how it worked. Every country would peg its currency to the dollar, and the dollar in turn would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. That meant that if France or India or Brazil wanted stability, they had to hold dollars. And if they wanted dollars, they had to trade with or borrow from the United States. A simple equation, but one that turned every nation's reserves into a claim on Washington. Then came the institutions, the tools of the new empire. The International Monetary Fund would act as a global referee, supervising currencies and providing short-term loans to countries in crisis, but always under strict conditions. The World Bank, officially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, would finance reconstruction and development, meaning in practice channeling U.S. capital into foreign projects that served U.S. interests. It wasn't colonialism in the old sense. No soldiers, no flags. But the logic was identical. Control the flows of credit, and you control the future. The British delegation understood it all too well. They had once ruled an empire where the pound sterling was the world's settlement currency. Now they were negotiating the terms of their own surrender. By the end of the conference, Keynes, the man who once lectured the world about balanced growth, was forced to sign what he called the greatest blow ever struck against Britain. The pound would now live under the dollar's shadow. London would remain a financial center, yes, but no longer the heart of global money. What began at Bretton Woods wasn't just a plan, it was a pivot. From gold as a universal standard to the dollar as a managed promise. From European colonialism to American financial leadership. And though it looked like an alliance, it was really an inheritance, the old imperial network reborn under a new master, with the same invisible hand: debt. Think of it like this. Every empire in history has needed a mechanism to extract value, tribute, taxes, or trade. The Bretton Woods system simply mechanized that process, turning it into accounting entries, exchange rates, and aid. And just as Rome taxed its provinces to sustain its legions, the post-war world would send its savings, in dollars, to sustain the American century. The ink dried on the agreements in December 1945. Within 2 years, both institutions were operational, and the world, exhausted, indebted, and desperate for stability, accepted the new hierarchy without question. What choice did they have? When you've just survived total war, any order looks like peace. But arithmetic has a strange way of revealing motives. Behind every loan, there was leverage. Behind every stabilization fund, a set of invisible strings. The global system had been rebuilt, not on equality, but on asymmetry. And once that structure was in place, growth was inevitable. But so was illusion. If you're still with me, if this picture of post-war reconstruction makes you rethink what stability really meant, drop a comment or a thought. Because what came next looked like prosperity, but was really the beginning of a global dependency engineered in Washington and priced in gold. For the next quarter century, the system seemed perfect. Factories roared, currency stabilized, and newspapers called it a miracle of peace. From 1945 to the late 1960s, the world believed it had finally solved the ancient riddle of money, how to grow forever without collapse. The illusion worked because it had all the right symbols. Gold in Fort Knox, dollar bills backed by that gold, and a network of international institutions promising discipline and order. To the average citizen, it looked like capitalism had matured, learned from its mistakes, and found a moral compass. But underneath the symmetry of exchange rates, a quiet imbalance was growing. Invisible, mathematical, unstoppable. Let's trace it. After the war, America's industrial base was unmatched. It produced half the world's goods, owned the ships that carried them, and lent the dollars that paid for them. European nations rebuilt using U.S. loans and grants. The Marshall Plan alone funneled over $13 billion, about $150 billion in today's money, into Western Europe. But every dollar sent abroad returned home eventually, because it could only buy one thing: American goods. This was the secret of the system. The U.S. exported both dollars and the means to redeem them. At first it seemed fair. Europe recovered, Japan rose, global trade exploded. The IMF watched over exchange rates like a benevolent referee, and the World Bank financed dams, railways, and development projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. To many nations, this was the first taste of inclusion, a seat at the table of world finance. But the fine print was clear. Inclusion meant indebtedness. If you borrowed, you obeyed. If you defaulted, you surrendered control of your budget, your industries, sometimes even your currency. Meanwhile, in the United States, something subtle began to change. To sustain global growth, Washington had to supply more and more dollars, because the world's reserves were dollars. But every new dollar created meant 1 ounce less of gold per promise. It was a slow dilution, hidden under layers of prosperity. The economists called it liquidity expansion. In truth, it was the beginning of inflation without end. Empire by arithmetic. Think of it like this. A magician can only perform the trick while the audience believes the hat has no bottom. As long as the world trusted that a dollar was worth its weight in gold, trade flowed and optimism ruled. But the hat was filling up. By 1959, U.S. gold reserves had fallen below $20 billion, while foreign dollar holdings exceeded $25 billion. The math had turned upside down. The world now held more claims on U.S. gold than the gold itself. Still, no one panicked. The illusion was too profitable. Europe rebuilt its industries, Japan became a manufacturing powerhouse, America's consumer boom turned suburbs into kingdoms of comfort, cars, fridges, televisions, all financed by cheap credit. The American dream became the world's dream, and the IMF's architecture looked like the spine of modern civilization. But remember, illusions thrive on trust, not truth. The entire Bretton Woods order was built on faith that the U.S. would never abuse its privilege, that gold would always anchor value, that numbers could grow forever without consequence. And so long as everyone played along, it seemed to work. Yet deep in the data, something was cracking. By the mid-1960s, the United States was fighting 2 wars, one in Vietnam and another at home, the war on poverty. Both were financed not by taxation, but by printing. Dollars poured into the world faster than ever before, and abroad, central bankers began to notice. Charles de Gaulle of France called it America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to pay for its deficits with paper everyone else treated as gold. He started demanding payment in metal, not promises. Ships left New York Harbor carrying France's gold home. Still, most of the world preferred the comfort of illusion to the cost of truth. As long as dollars flowed, no one wanted to break the spell. It was the golden age of apparent stability, and the countdown to its mathematical end. If this part makes you see the post-war boom less as a miracle and more as a balance sheet trick, share it. Because what the world mistook for permanent prosperity was only the middle act of a story that would soon reveal how politics bends to arithmetic, and never the other way around. It began, as it always does, with confidence. Too much of it. By the end of the 1960s, the United States stood at the center of a world economy it no longer truly controlled. Every country held its reserves in dollars. Every central bank trusted the U.S. Treasury's promise that each paper note could be exchanged for gold at $35 an ounce. But that promise had quietly become impossible. The vaults were half empty, the math unforgiving. The empire had entered what economists politely call a liquidity dilemma. In plain terms, there were more dollars than there was gold to back them. By 1971, foreign holders owned about $60 billion worth of dollars, while the United States held barely $10 billion in gold that could be used for foreign redemption. Arithmetic once again outgrew diplomacy. No speech could fix it. The first cracks appeared in 1968 when the London Gold Pool, an alliance of 8 central banks that tried to defend the $35 price by selling gold into the market, collapsed under the pressure of rising demand. Speculators, investors, even governments no longer believed the price could hold. They began converting their dollars to metal, draining American reserves week after week. It was the same story every empire tells itself at the end. We can afford it, until the numbers say otherwise. Meanwhile, the war in Vietnam devoured billions. U.S. troops burned through fuel, ammunition, and borrowed money. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs printed even more. To cover it all, Washington exported paper. Dollars flowed abroad like a flood and returned as claims against gold. Europe had rebuilt. Japan had caught up. The U.S. could no longer play both banker and buyer of last resort. By 1971, the situation was untenable. Foreign governments, led by France, then Switzerland, then Britain, lined up to redeem their paper. De Gaulle had sent a warship, the Colbert, to New York to bring home France's gold. Other nations followed quietly, without the theatrics, but with the same message: we no longer believe. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television. He called it a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. In reality, it was the end of the Bretton Woods system, the mathematical backbone of the post-war world. The gold window slammed shut. From that moment, the dollar was no longer a promise to pay in metal. It was a promise backed only by itself and by America's power to enforce its value. The IMF, created to maintain fixed exchange rates, suddenly found itself guarding a system that no longer existed. The World Bank kept lending, but its loans now came from a currency floating freely, untethered from any standard but trust. The empire of numbers had replaced the empire of gold. A new age began, one where money could be created by keystrokes, debt could grow without anchor, and the rules of the game were rewritten in Washington's favor. The exposure wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. The illusion of discipline had vanished. The world had believed it was living under a rule of arithmetic, but arithmetic had been bent to politics. For a few years, the consequences rippled through everything. The oil crisis of 1973, the stagflation of the 1970s, the debt booms that followed. When currencies float, trust must anchor them, and trust, as history shows, is the rarest commodity of all. Look closely and you'll see the pattern. Every system collapses not because of bad intentions, but because the numbers outgrow the promises. The same logic that sank gold backing in 1971 still haunts every central bank today. We print, we spend, we believe, until we can't. If this part made you realize that 1971 wasn't just a policy decision, but the quiet end of an entire world order, right where you're watching from. Because after that night, the global economy entered its purest experiment yet, a world where faith itself became the currency. When the gold window closed in 1971, it didn't just end an economic arrangement, it rewired the world's bloodstream. Money was no longer tied to metal, but to motion. From that moment on, every dollar in existence became a claim on future productivity, not present wealth. And the United States, which owned the printing press of the New World, had just inherited the empire of the future. Think about it. For centuries, empires conquered territory to extract gold, grain, and tribute. Now they could create credit instead. The tribute system turned digital, invisible, and infinitely expandable. With the dollar unpegged, the United States could finance deficits simply by issuing treasury bonds, IOUs that the rest of the world willingly bought, because every nation still needed dollars to trade, invest, and service its debts. The IMF and the World Bank became the gatekeepers of this new order, enforcing reform programs and structural adjustments that always pointed in one direction: privatize, liberalize, and pay in dollars. The 1980s proved how powerful this new mechanism was. Oil shocks and interest rate hikes pushed developing nations into crisis. Countries from Latin America to Africa borrowed heavily during the cheap money years of the 1970s. But when U.S. interest rates soared under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, their debts became unpayable overnight. One by one, they turned to the IMF for rescue. And the rescue always came with conditions. Governments had to cut social spending, sell public industries, and open their markets to foreign capital. The euphemism was stabilization. The reality was dependency. Nations that had once been politically decolonized found themselves financially recolonized. Instead of governors, they now had consultants. Instead of armies, they faced spreadsheets. Each bailout preserved the system by transferring the pain downward from creditors to citizens. Meanwhile, the World Bank financed vast development projects, dams, highways, and power grids that often served multinational corporations more than the local populations. The debts piled up, and so did the leverage. By the 1990s, the phrase Washington Consensus became a polite synonym for empire, and the IMF's approval became the modern equivalent of royal assent. Without it, no nation could borrow, trade, or attract investors. Then came globalization, the final illusion of unity. Factories moved east, finance moved nowhere, and dollars moved everywhere. China joined the game, producing goods in exchange for paper promises, accumulating trillions in U.S. bonds. Europe created its own currency, the euro, yet still cleared its trades through the dollar. Even the digital revolution, the rise of Silicon Valley, was financed by the same principle, debt as destiny. Money, unanchored, flowed wherever confidence pointed. And yet, beneath the glitter of markets and technology, the same math kept ticking. Debt grew faster than income. Bubbles replaced productivity. Every crisis, 1987, 1997, 2008, 2020, was met with the same cure: more credit, cheaper money, deeper entanglement. Each bailout preserved the illusion for a little longer. But the logic of Bretton Woods never died. It simply went digital. The dollar remained the core, the IMF the judge, and the World Bank the engineer. Even today, when you hear about debt restructuring, special drawing rights, or financial assistance, you're hearing the modern echo of 1944, the same empire speaking a new language. What began as a gold-backed pact among nations has become a belief system. And belief, unlike metal, has no limit until it breaks. When central banks create trillions with a keystroke, they're following the path first opened at Bretton Woods, to stabilize the world by inflating it. The question isn't whether the system will last, but how long faith can substitute for substance. If this makes you see today's headlines about sovereign debt, currency wars, or dollar shortages as chapters in an older story, you're starting to see the pattern. The empire didn't fall after the war, it globalized. And every time you swipe a card, take a loan, or watch a country receive aid, you're touching the invisible architecture built in 1944. Still standing, still ruling, still called stability. So here we are, 8 decades after Bretton Woods, still living inside its design. The names have changed, the tools have evolved, but the logic remains the same. Power flows not from armies, but from credit. And every generation rediscovers too late that money is not neutral. It's a language of obedience. What began as a plan to stabilize the world became a structure to govern it. The IMF and World Bank were built with noble words: reconstruction, development, cooperation. But systems, like people, reveal their character in crisis. When debt explodes, they don't ask why. They ask how to keep the payments coming. The morality of the system isn't compassion, it's continuity. The mathematics must be served. We've seen it again and again. In the 1980s, Latin America was told to tighten its belt while paying interest to New York. In the 1990s, Russia sold its industries under the advice of Western experts. In the 2000s, entire nations of Europe, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, discovered that sovereignty ends where the spreadsheet begins. And in 2020, as the pandemic shut the world, the same logic resurfaced. Trillions printed overnight, not to rebuild lives, but to preserve valuations. The illusion of abundance, maintained at all costs. If you look closely, you'll see the same pattern that began in 1944. Debt disguised as salvation, growth built on leverage, stability bought with dependency. Every empire masters the art of turning necessity into virtue. They used to call it civilization. Then free trade. Now financial stability. Different words, same tribute. Arithmetic cannot be deceived. You can rename debt investment or print liquidity, but numbers always find balance in inflation, in crisis, or in collapse. And that's the quiet law that outlives every institution. Systems don't fail because of bad intentions. They fail when the numbers outgrow trust. So if you're hearing this in 2025, remember, the empire of money was built in peacetime, not war. It didn't conquer, it invited. And each time a nation signs an IMF agreement or floats a new bond, the circle closes again. Voluntary vassalage, digitized and debt-financed. The currency may change, from gold to paper to code, but the principle stays eternal. Whoever controls credit controls destiny. Watch the patterns, not the promises. Because somewhere, in a new conference room, another Bretton Woods is already being written. Quietly, rationally, inevitably. If this made you rethink what post-war peace really meant, share it, and let others see how empire never ended. It just learned to compound interest.